There's a kind of man this world produces quietly, not loudly, not on stages or in headlines, in neighborhoods, in clubhouses, on roads before dawn when the city is still asleep, and a man on a motorcycle is the only moving thing for miles. A man who built something real, who earned what he had, who gave more than he took. Not because someone was watching, but because that was simply who he was. And then one morning, on a walk he'd taken 100 times, everything he built began to disappear. Not slowly, all at once. This is the story of Richard Lucas, a man who lost everything to a lie, a man who gave his last dollar to a stranger, and a woman who decided that a man like that deserved to have his life back. This is a story about what the legal system can do to an innocent person and what it takes to fight back. This is a Royal Brothers MC story. Richard Lucas did not inherit his wealth. He built it the way men of his generation built things. Slowly, carefully, with his hands and his judgment and 20 years of decisions that compounded into something real. By his mid-50s, Richard owned several properties across London, a business that employed people from his community, a reputation that meant something on streets that didn't give reputations away cheaply. And he rode with the Royal Brothers MC, not a criminal organization, not an outlaw club, a brotherhood of working men, veterans, tradespeople, fathers, who had been part of London's overlooked communities for decades, men who showed up when official systems didn't, who protected people who had no one else to call. Richard was not the loudest man in the clubhouse. He was the one everyone turned to when something needed deciding, the one whose word meant the situation was settled. He had worked his entire life to build something that mattered. He had no idea how quickly it could be taken away. Before we go further, it is important to understand something about how the legal system works. Because what happens to Richard is not fiction in the way people imagine fiction. The mechanisms used against him are real. They happen to real people. And understanding them is the first step to protecting yourself. When a financial claim is filed against a person, even an unproven one, a court can issue what is called a freezing order. A freezing order means your bank accounts are locked. Your assets cannot be moved, sold, or accessed. Your properties are effectively placed in legal hold. You are not convicted of anything. You are not found guilty of anything. But you cannot touch your own money while the legal process works itself out. This process can take months, sometimes years. And while your assets are frozen, your business stops. Your employees have no payroll. Your mortgage payments cannot be made. Your legal defense, ironically, must be funded from resources that are now locked away. A freezing order is a legal tool designed to protect victims of genuine financial crime. But in the hands of someone willing to fabricate evidence, it becomes a weapon. And Herbert knew exactly how to use it. Herbert had lived beside Richard Lucas for 11 years. On the surface, everything a city like London respects. A newspaper auditor of 23 years standing. A man whose professional life was built around finding financial wrongdoing, around reading documents, tracing money, exposing the people who thought they could hide what they had done. The city trusted Herbert because Herbert's job was truth, which made him uniquely dangerous when he decided to construct a lie. Herbert wanted Richard's properties, not because he needed them, because they bordered his own, because owning them would consolidate something in his world that Richard's presence disrupted. He had made offers, reasonable offers, he felt, generous offers. Richard declined everyone, not rudely, not with hostility. Simply no. These properties were part of something Richard had built. They were not for sale. Herbert smiled each time, nodded, went home, and began to think carefully about what a man in his position could do. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Richard left his home at 6:45 in the morning, the same time he always left, the same route he always walked, through a street, left at the corner, across the cut-through that trimmed 4 minutes off his walk to the gym. The cut-through crossed the edge of Herbert's property, a corner, a strip of land barely wider than a pavement. Richard had walked it for years, had never thought twice about it. Herbert was watching from his window that morning, and for the first time, he smiled. He had his reason. The trespassing complaint was filed that afternoon, but Herbert was not interested in trespassing. Trespassing was a beginning, a door Herbert opened just wide enough to push everything else through. Over the following weeks, Herbert constructed something that only a man with his expertise could build. Forged financial records showing transactions between Richard's business accounts and Herbert's personal accounts. Transactions that never happened. Fabricated invoices. Altered dates on documents that made it appear Richard had been systematically siphoning money from Herbert over a period of 3 years. 100,000 pounds. Not an enormous sum for a billionaire, but that was the point. Large enough to be serious. Small enough to be believable. The kind of amount that could slip through the cracks of a busy business without anyone noticing. Here is something the legal system struggles to protect against. When financial evidence is fabricated by someone with genuine expertise, someone who understands how courts read documents, how financial records are verified, what judges look for, the fabrication can be nearly indistinguishable from the truth. Courts rely on documentation, on paper trails, on the credibility of the person presenting the evidence. Herbert was a newspaper auditor. His professional credibility was his most powerful weapon. When he presented forged documents, he presented them with the confidence and language of a man who had spent decades exposing exactly this kind of financial crime. The court did not see a liar. It saw an expert witness. Richard's lawyers fought the case repeatedly. They challenged the evidence. They filed appeals. They spent enormous resources trying to demonstrate what Richard knew, that the transactions never happened. But here's the brutal reality of a freezing order combined with fabricated evidence. Your assets are locked while you fight. Your legal fees drain whatever resources you have outside the freeze. Every appeal costs money Richard was running out of. Every delay benefits the person who constructed the lie, because time itself becomes a weapon against you. Richard paid the 100,000 pounds, not because he was guilty, because continuing to fight was costing him more than settling. And Herbert knew that when he chose a number. After the payment, the collapse came quickly. Legal fees had consumed his reserves. His business had hemorrhaged without operational funds during the freeze. Properties he had mortgaged to fund his defense were now in arrears. Everything Richard Lucas had built over 20 years, gone within 18 months of that Tuesday morning walk. This is not a fictional mechanism. This is how legal manipulation destroys real people. Remember that. London does not pause for men who fall. The city moves. The buses run. The people walk with their heads forward and their coats pulled against the wind. Richard Lucas moved through it like a ghost. He had a bicycle, a worn jacket, a few possessions in a bag he kept close. He knew the doorways that offered some shelter, the places that would let him sit without being moved on immediately, the rhythms of a city that had forgotten him. He did not tell the royal brothers where he was. He told himself it was pride, that he didn't want his brothers seeing him like this, that he would find a way back on his own before anyone needed to know how far he had fallen. The truth was simpler and harder than pride. He didn't know how to be Richard Lucas, brother, leader, the man people turned to when he was also this, a man on a pavement, a man being moved on from doorways, a man with nothing. So he disappeared into the city, and Gerald, his oldest brother in the Royal Brothers, rode the streets of London looking for him, week after week, never finding him, never stopping, keeping Richard's seat at the table, telling anyone who would listen, Richard didn't do this. The day Christie lost her bag was not a dramatic day. She had stepped out of a meeting, one of dozens that filled her calendar, and somewhere between the building lobby and the street, her bag was gone. Cards, phone, cash, everything. Christie was one of London's most quietly powerful figures. Not a celebrity, not a public personality. The kind of wealth that does not need to announce itself. She had resources and connections that most people could not imagine, and she was standing on a London pavement with nothing, unable to get home, unable to call anyone, slightly stunned by the sheer ordinariness of the problem. Richard saw her before she saw him. He read the situation the way men with his instincts read situations. Quickly and accurately, a woman standing still while the city moved around her. The particular stillness of someone who doesn't know what their next move is. He approached carefully, quietly, the way you approach someone who might be frightened by a stranger. He asked if she was all right. She told him what had happened. He reached into his jacket without hesitation. What he gave her was not much. Enough for a cab. Enough to get home. Possibly everything he had that day. He didn't give his name. Didn't wait for thanks. Simply told her it was all right and turned and walked away. Christie stood on that pavement for a long moment after he left. Then she got in the cab and could not stop thinking about him the entire way home. 3 days later, Christie went back. She told herself she wanted to return the money, that it was simply the right thing to do. But the truth was she needed to understand something about the man she had met. Something about the quality of what he had done, the complete absence of calculation in it, that she had not encountered in the world she inhabited. She found him being moved on from a shop doorway, a security guard, raised voice, the practiced authority of someone who did this regularly and felt nothing about it. Richard was gathering his things quietly, not arguing. The particular dignity of a man who has learned that arguing costs more than it returns. Christie stepped in before she had decided to step in. She told the security guard in a voice that carried more authority than his uniform that the man he was speaking to deserved to be treated with basic human dignity. The security guard looked at her, looked at Richard, left. Richard turned and looked at the woman who had just defended him. He did not recognize her. He thanked her simply, told her she didn't need to do that. She said she knew. She asked if she could buy him a meal. He looked at her for a moment, this well-dressed woman who had just stepped between him and a security guard without blinking. He said yes. They sat in a small cafe 2 streets away. Christie asked quiet questions, not prying, not performing concern. Genuinely trying to understand how a man who carried himself the way Richard Lucas carried himself had ended up where he was. Richard did not tell her everything, not at first, but there was something about the directness of her attention, the complete absence of the pity he had learned to expect from people who notice him, that loosened something he had kept tightly closed. He told her about the allegations, the freezing order, the legal fight, the payment. He told her about the properties he had lost, the business, the years of work that had been systematically dismantled by a process he had been unable to stop. He did not tell her about the Royal Brothers. Not yet. Christie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him one question. Do you still have any of the original documentation from your case? Richard looked at her. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket and placed a folded envelope on the table between them. He had carried it with him every day since the day he lost everything. Christy looked at the envelope, looked at Richard. "My name is Christy," she said, "and I think someone did something to you that can be undone. Many people believe that once a legal case is closed and a settlement paid, it is over, finished, permanent. This is not always true. There are specific circumstances under which a settled or closed case can be reopened. Understanding these circumstances is important because they represent the protection the legal system offers against exactly the kind of manipulation Richard experienced. New evidence. If evidence emerges that was not available during the original proceedings, and that evidence is material to the outcome, an application can be made to reopen the case. This is not easy, but it is possible. Evidence of fraud upon the court. If it can be demonstrated that fabricated evidence was presented to the court, that the original proceedings were built on a deliberate lie. This is one of the most serious violations of legal process recognized in law. Courts take this extremely seriously. A case built on fraudulent evidence is not a settled case. It is a crime. Professional misconduct. When the person who fabricated evidence holds a professional position, an auditor, an accountant, a financial professional, their professional body has independent authority to investigate. A finding of professional misconduct can trigger parallel legal proceedings entirely separate from the original civil case. Christie's legal team understood all three of these pathways, and Herbert, for all his expertise, had made the mistake that overconfident people always make. He had been too precise, too professional, too neat. The documents he forged carried the methodology of a man who audits for a living. The language, the formatting, the specific ways financial records were structured and cross-referenced. To a court reading them as evidence against Richard, they looked convincing. To Christie's forensic accountants reading them as potential forgeries, they looked like Herbert's work. Every forged document has an author. Herbert had simply forgotten that he was identifiable in his own fabrications. Christie made one phone call before she went further. She had found the Royal brothers MC through the documents Richard carried. A name, an address, a connection to the man's life before the street. Gerald answered on the third ring. He was in the clubhouse when she called, sitting at the table where Richard's seat had been empty for over a year. Christie told him who she was, told him she had found Richard, told him she was looking into the case. There was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds. Then Gerald said, "I've been waiting for this phone call." They met the following day. A cafe across the city. Gerald arrived in his cut, the Royal Brothers MC patch on his back, his face carrying the particular weariness of a man who has been holding something together through sheer will for a very long time. He told Christie everything he knew about Richard, about the morning the allegations hit the club, about the brothers who pulled back, not from malice, but from confusion and fear, about the ones who came back when they understood what had really happened, and the guilt they carried. He told her about riding the streets of London looking for Richard every weekend for months. He told her about the empty seat. Christie listened to everything. When Gerald finished, she asked him, "If we can clear his name, if we can restore what was taken, is the brotherhood still there for him?" Gerald looked at her steadily. "That seat has never been filled," he said. "Not once." Christie's legal team worked for 6 weeks. Forensic accountants, fraud specialists, a barrister with 20 years of experience in financial crime cases. What they found was exactly what Christie's instinct had told her they would find. The fabricated documents were Herbert's work, unmistakably. The methodology, the way financial records had been structured and cross-referenced, matched Herbert's published auditing work in specific and demonstrable ways. A man cannot spend 23 years developing a professional signature and then abandon it when he decides to commit fraud. The dates on 3 key documents were impossible. They referenced account numbers that did not exist at the time the transactions were allegedly recorded. A witness who had supported Herbert's account during the original proceedings, a colleague, had since left his position under a cloud of his own. When approached by Christie's investigators, he was considerably less certain of his recollection than he had been 18 months earlier. The application to reopen the case was filed on a Wednesday morning. Herbert was notified by his own lawyers on a Thursday. By Friday, for the first time since that Tuesday morning walk to the gym, Richard Lucas's name was moving through the legal system in the right direction. The proceedings took 4 months. Herbert's professional credibility, the thing that had made his lies so effective, became the thing that destroyed him. The forensic analysis of his fabricated documents was presented by people who spoke his professional language fluently. Every methodology he had used to construct a lie was identified, named, and attributed. The court found that the original proceedings had been built on fraudulent evidence. Herbert's case was dismissed entirely. The £100,000 was ordered returned. Richard's properties, those that had been seized through the legal process, were restored. Herbert was referred to the professional body for the most serious misconduct investigation of his career. The man who had spent 23 years exposing financial wrongdoing was now the subject of financial wrongdoing investigation himself. Richard Lucas sat in that courtroom and heard his name cleared. He had carried the documentation of his innocence in a folded envelope in his jacket pocket for over a year. He sat very still when the judgment was read, and said nothing for a long time afterward. It was a Thursday evening when Richard Lucas walked back into the Royal Brothers MC clubhouse. Gerald had told the brothers he was coming. Not much more than that. Just, Richard is coming tonight. The clubhouse was full. Men who had known Richard for a decade. Men who had ridden with him, argued with him, laughed with him, trusted him with their worst moments and their best ones. Men who had carried guilt about the months they had doubted. Richard stood in the doorway for a moment. Gerald crossed the room and put his arms around him without saying a word. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something that has been wrong for a long time is finally made right. Then it was not quiet anymore. Richard did not cry until much later, until the room had filled with noise and someone had put something in his hand, and the brothers were talking over each other the way they always had. He sat in his seat that had never been filled, and felt, for the first time in over a year, like Richard Lucas again. Christie did not come inside. She stood across the street in the London evening and watched the light in the clubhouse window, watched the shadows of men who were glad to have their brother back. She had not told Richard the full extent of what she had done, had not needed him to thank her, had not needed anything from the outcome except the outcome itself. She thought about a man on a pavement reaching into his jacket without hesitation, about what it cost him to do that, about the kind of person who gives everything when they have nothing and asks for nothing in return. She turned up her collar against the London wind and walked away smiling. Richard Lucas lost everything to a lie constructed by a man who understood the legal system well enough to weaponize it. He lost his properties, his business, his financial standing, his place in the world he had spent 20 years building. But he never lost the thing that made him who he was. On the worst days of his life, with nothing in his pocket and nowhere to sleep, he saw a stranger who needed help, and he helped her, not because he expected anything back, because that was simply who he was. The legal system failed Richard Lucas when it mattered most. It took someone who refused to accept that failure, Someone who understood that freezing orders and fabricated evidence and professional credibility can be dismantled if you have the knowledge and the will to dismantle them, to restore what should never have been taken. Not every Richard Lucas has a Christie, but every Richard Lucas deserves one. Before we close, here is what Richard's story teaches us about the legal system and financial manipulation. A freezing order can be issued against your assets based on unproven allegations, locking your money while you fight. The legal process of fighting a freezing order is expensive, and that expense is part of how manipulation works. Fabricated financial evidence constructed by a professional is difficult to detect without forensic expertise, but it always carries the author's fingerprints. Settled cases are not always permanent. New evidence, fraud upon the court, and professional misconduct are all pathways to reopening what was closed. The most powerful weapon against legal manipulation is documentation. Keep everything, always, no matter what. Richard kept his documentation in a folded envelope in his jacket pocket every single day. That envelope helped give him his life back. Before you go, we want to hear from you. Richard Lucas was destroyed by a legal system that was supposed to protect him. Do you believe the legal system truly protects ordinary people from powerful accusers? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one.